Lillian Cross had never imagined that safety could become such a complicated subject. Yet that was the strange reality she was living in when she finally settled into her modest house in a quiet Oklahoma neighborhood, a place that promised normalcy and stability after the chaos of her previous life. Just a year earlier, she and her 9-year-old son, Ethan, had lost nearly everything to a tornado that tore through the small town where she grew up, leaving behind not only physical destruction, but a lingering sense of fear that had become part of their daily rhythm. Ethan had developed a habit of waking in the middle of the night at the slightest rumble of thunder, convinced that the roof would be ripped away again, and Lillian could not shake the memory of crouching in a flimsy hallway with her arms around him, while the sound of breaking glass and roaring wind pressed against the walls. When she bought the new house, she promised herself that she would never again face a storm without real protection, no matter what it cost her, and that promise became almost an obsession when she discovered that most of her new neighbors had no shelters at all, relying instead on luck and insurance. The house itself was nothing extraordinary, a single-story brick home with a neatly trimmed lawn, but to Lillian, it felt like a fragile sanctuary that needed reinforcement, so she began making plans for an underground storm shelter to be installed in the backyard. It was not an impulsive decision. She spent months researching contractors, reading city regulations, and speaking with officials about permits. She wanted every step to be correct because she knew from experience that once a crisis struck, there would be no time for improvisation. She even spoke with Ethan about it in gentle terms, explaining that the small door in the yard would lead to a place where they could be safe together when the winds came back. And though he nodded, she could see in his eyes how much he longed for that reassurance. For a brief time, everything seemed to fall into place. The contractor she hired was patient and professional. The city approved the installation after reviewing the plans, and she arranged financing that would allow her to cover the expense without jeopardizing the household budget she balanced so carefully as a single mother. When the crew arrived and began unloading heavy concrete slabs, she felt a sense of relief that bordered on triumph, as though she were finally keeping the promise she had made to herself and her child on that terrible night of the tornado. The sound of machinery in the backyard was not noise to her but a kind of music, proof that her home was becoming more than walls and a roof. It was becoming a refuge. That was when she first noticed Karen. At the time, Lillian thought little of the woman who lingered by the sidewalk, watching the construction with arms folded and an expression that hovered between curiosity and disapproval. Lillian had introduced herself to a few neighbors when she moved in, but Karen had not been one of them, and now, standing at the edge of the property in a crisp blouse and perfectly pressed slacks, she looked less like a neighbor and more like a supervisor checking for violations. Their eyes met briefly, and Karen gave a thin smile that never reached her eyes, then walked away without a word, leaving Lillian unsettled but not yet worried. She turned her focus back to the contractors, reminding herself that she had done everything properly, that she had all the necessary approvals, and that no one could possibly object to something as simple and essential as protecting her family from a storm. Yet the feeling lingered, a faint unease that returned whenever she saw Karen's car parked near the corner of the street or caught sight of her speaking to other neighbors in hushed tones. There was something about the woman's posture, the way she carried herself as if she owned not just her property but the entire block, that set Lillian on edge. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was simply nervous after so much upheaval, but deep down she suspected that Karen's interest was not benign. Still, at this stage, Lillian dismissed it as nothing more than idle curiosity, unaware that the installation of the storm shelter would ignite a conflict that had little to do with safety or community, and everything to do with control, money, and power hidden behind the smiling face of a neighborhood association. The first real sign that something was wrong came only a few days after the contractors had poured the foundation of the shelter. Lillian was standing in her kitchen rinsing dishes when she noticed flashing lights through the window. the kind of bright, pulsing beams that could only belong to a police car. At first, she thought there must have been an accident at the corner, or perhaps someone down the street had called for help. But when she stepped outside, she found 2 officers at the curb in front of her house, speaking with none other than Karen, who was pointing toward the backyard with exaggerated gestures. The officers were polite when they approached, asking if they could take a look at the work being done, and though their tone was neutral, Lillian felt her chest tighten with dread, because she understood in that instant that Karen had called them not, out of genuine concern but to establish some form of authority over what she clearly considered her domain. Lillian led them to the yard, explained that she had all the proper permits, and even produced the folder of documents she had kept on the kitchen counter for precisely this reason, knowing that bureaucracy had no patience for verbal assurances. The officers scanned the papers, nodded, and told her they saw no violation of city law, but they added in measured tones that the Neighborhood Homeowners Association might have its own rules and that they would pass along the situation, so it could be reviewed. They left without issuing any citation, but Karen remained on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, her mouth set in a thin, satisfied line, as though she had accomplished exactly what she intended by involving the police, planting the seed of fear. That Lillian was somehow already in the wrong. That night, Lillian could not sleep, replaying the image of Karen whispering to the officers while pointing toward her yard, and though she reassured Ethan that everything was fine, she felt the uneasy sensation of being watched in her own home. Her fears were confirmed the following afternoon when a letter appeared in her mailbox, embossed with the official seal of the Homeowners Association. It was written in the stiff, impersonal language of authority, informing her that construction on her property was to be halted immediately until the board could determine whether the storm shelter was in compliance with community aesthetic standards. The phrase struck her as absurd. What aesthetic could matter when lives were at stake during a tornado? Yet the tone of the letter was not one of negotiation but of command, and at the bottom was Karen's signature in sharp, assertive strokes, marking not just her authority as HOA president, but her intent to make this into a battle. Lillian read the letter 3 times, her pulse racing, then called the city permitting office to confirm what she already knew. The clerk patiently explained that her permits were valid and the city had no objections to the shelter, but when she asked whether the HOA had any legal grounds to interfere, the clerk hesitated before admitting that neighborhood associations could impose additional restrictions so long as they did not conflict with state safety regulations. It was a vague answer that offered no real comfort, and Lillian realized she was stepping into territory where rules were not enforced by common sense or public need, but by the whims of a private council led by a woman who clearly disliked her. Over the next several days, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted in ways both subtle and sharp. Neighbors who had once waved now averted their eyes or hurried inside when she approached, as though merely being seen speaking with her might draw Karen's disapproval. A mother who had allowed her children to play with Ethan politely declined an invitation to the park, murmuring something about wanting to avoid conflict. The contractors, though willing to continue, warned Lillian that they had received phone calls from someone claiming to represent the HOA, threatening fines if they proceeded, and though the men were sympathetic, they made it clear that they could not risk entanglement with the association's lawyers. One morning, Lillian discovered a fresh envelope taped to her front door, this one more aggressive in tone, citing specific bylaws that prohibited unauthorized structural modifications without prior approval from the board and threatening escalating daily fines if construction did not cease. It was not merely a warning anymore. It was financial coercion. Ethan noticed the tension, asking why the men who had promised to finish the safe room were no longer coming, and Lillian, caught between honesty and the desire to shield him from fear, simply said that some people in the neighborhood did not understand how important safety was. Inside, though, she felt a rising anger that threatened to eclipse the anxiety, because she could not comprehend how a group of neighbors could oppose something that might one day save not only her son, but their own families. Yet, as she examined the latest letter, she realized this was not about misunderstanding, but about control, and Karen had chosen her as the battleground. The breaking point came when Karen herself appeared on Lillian's porch one evening just as the sun was setting, her knock sharp and authoritative rather than neighborly. She carried a binder tucked under her arm and spoke in a measured tone that masked hostility with politeness, informing Lillian that several residents had expressed concerns about the shelter lowering property values, and that as president of the HOA she was obligated to act. Lillian replied that the shelter was a matter of safety, not aesthetics, but Karen countered smoothly that rules existed for a reason, and that exceptions created chaos in the community. When Lillian insisted that she would not stop construction, Karen's smile thinned further, and she said in a voice quiet enough that only Lillian could hear, "You may have the city's papers, but around here, we decide what stands and what doesn't. If you continue, you'll regret it." With that, she turned and left, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, leaving behind not just a threat but a chilling reminder that this conflict was no longer about paperwork, but about power, and Lillian's determination to protect her son had placed her in direct opposition to a woman who thrived on control. The following weeks unfolded with the slow precision of a siege, each day marked not by open confrontation but by small, deliberate acts designed to wear Lillian down. And though she tried to hold on to her patience, the weight of constant pressure began to press on her chest like the humid summer air that seemed to linger without relief. The construction of the shelter had been suspended because the contractors refused to return under the shadow of legal threats from the Homeowners Association, leaving the backyard scarred with an unfinished pit lined with concrete, a daily reminder of how close she had come to providing safety for her son, and how abruptly it had been taken away. What disturbed her most was not the hole itself, but the way Karen seemed to treat it as a trophy, passing by at odd hours of the day to glance over the fence, her gaze cool and appraising, as if she were inspecting the progress of her victory. The letters from the HOA multiplied, each one phrased in slightly more aggressive terms, citing bylaws with the kind of obscure references that forced Lillian to read the same sentence over and over before she could even begin to understand its meaning. They demanded immediate payment of fines for unauthorized excavation, for failure to obtain architectural approval, and even for disturbance of neighborhood harmony, a phrase so vague it felt like satire if not for the fact that it carried a very real financial penalty. Lillian knew she had not violated any legitimate regulation, yet the numbers on the page grew larger with each envelope, climbing into hundreds of dollars, then threatening thousands. And though she refused to pay, the intimidation was effective in its own way. She found herself dreading the sound of the mailbox creaking open in the morning, knowing that another envelope would be waiting like a snake coiled on her doorstep. Her neighbors began to change around her, not in dramatic gestures but in subtle silences. The family across the street, who had once waved as Ethan rode his bicycle past their driveway, now looked away quickly as though afraid of being drawn into her orbit. At the grocery store, she overheard fragments of whispers, phrases like causing trouble and doesn't follow the rules. And she realized with a cold jolt that Karen was not merely enforcing bylaws, but shaping the narrative of who Lillian was in the eyes of the community. It was not enough to block her shelter. Karen wanted to isolate her, to make her an example of what happened to those who resisted. One evening, Ethan returned from school quieter than usual, pushing his backpack into the corner and avoiding her gaze. When she pressed him gently, he admitted that another boy had told him his mom was ruining the neighborhood, and that their house would be taken away if she didn't stop fighting. Lillian felt her throat tighten with fury and helplessness, because the conflict had slipped beyond adult disputes into the fragile world of children, where rumors carried the weight of truth. She assured Ethan that their home was safe, But when he asked if the shelter would ever be finished, she could not bring herself to answer directly, and the uncertainty in her silence hurt them both more than any fine or letter could. Determined not to surrender, Lillian sought legal counsel, scraping together the money for an initial consultation with a lawyer recommended by a colleague at work. The attorney, a calm woman named Rebecca Hanley, reviewed the stack of letters and shook her head slowly, explaining that while the HOA had broad powers, they could not invent bylaws retroactively or apply penalties that contradicted city permits. Yet, she added, the fight would not be simple because Karen had clearly maneuvered the board into alignment with her interests, and challenging their decisions would require patience, evidence, and the willingness to endure months of hostility. Lillian left the office with a mixture of hope and dread, clutching the lawyer's card as if it were a lifeline, but knowing that the struggle ahead would consume more energy and money than she could easily spare. The very next day, as if sensing her renewed determination, Karen escalated her tactics. A notice appeared, taped not just to the front door but to the garage, the mailbox, even the fence post, creating a grotesque collage of accusations that made the house look like a crime scene. That evening, a neighbor whom Lillian barely knew stopped by under the pretense of returning a misdelivered package, but lingered long enough to suggest, in a tone heavy with rehearsed concern, that perhaps she should just consider withdrawing the project for the sake of peace. It was clear to Lillian that Karen had begun recruiting emissaries, using others to deliver pressure where her own words might fail. The most unnerving moment, however, came late one night when Lillian stepped into the backyard to let the dog out and found a flashlight beam sweeping across the unfinished pit. She froze in the shadows, her heart pounding, and recognized Karen's silhouette standing just beyond the fence, the light in her hand tracing the outline of the concrete walls as if cataloging evidence. When Lillian called out, Karen did not startle or apologize, but simply lowered the beam and replied in a calm voice that carried across the quiet air, "We'll be making sure this doesn't go any further." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Lillian shaken by the brazen certainty of someone who believed she was untouchable. By this point, it was no longer a dispute about a storm shelter. It was a contest of wills, and Karen had positioned herself as judge, jury, and executioner of neighborhood order. Lillian knew that backing down would not only forfeit the shelter, but would cement Karen's control, ensuring that any future attempt at independence would be crushed under the weight of the precedent. And so, standing at the window that overlooked the backyard pit, she whispered to herself that she would fight, even if the cost was greater than she imagined, because surrender would mean not only betraying her promise to Ethan, but accepting a life dictated by the whims of someone who thrived on fear. The turning point came on a humid Thursday evening, when the Neighborhood Homeowners Association convened its monthly meeting in the community center, a low brick building with fluorescent lights that hummed faintly and folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. Lillian had received the notice of the meeting in the mail alongside yet another demand for payment of fines, and though every part of her wanted to avoid the theater of hostility that she knew awaited her, Rebecca, her attorney, urged her to attend and present her documents openly, because silence, she warned, would be interpreted as surrender. Lillian walked into the hall with a folder under her arm containing the city permits, inspection reports, and photographs of the approved plans, determined to show that her project was legal, necessary, and far from the reckless act of defiance Karen had portrayed it to be. The room, however, was already weighted against her, with Karen seated at the head of a long table, flanked by board members who nodded at her every word as though she were a conductor and they the obedient instruments of her orchestra. From the moment Lillian entered, she felt the shift of attention, the way conversations dimmed and eyes turned, not in welcome but in scrutiny. Ethan sat quietly beside her, drawing shapes in the corner of his notebook, unaware of the political theater unfolding around him, while Karen cleared her throat with exaggerated formality and announced that tonight's agenda would begin with a serious violation of community standards. She gestured toward Lillian with the confidence of someone who believed the verdict was already decided. The board members murmured in agreement as Karen produced a folder of her own, pulling out a sheet of paper with dramatic flair before holding it aloft as though it were incontrovertible proof. She claimed it was a signed covenant agreement from when Lillian had purchased the house, a document stating that no exterior structures could be added without prior approval of the association. The page bore a signature at the bottom that, to the untrained eye, resembled Lillian's, but she felt her stomach drop because she had never seen the document before, and the shape of the letters was wrong, slightly too precise, lacking the small. Irregularities of her handwriting. When Karen slid the document across the table toward her, Lillian forced herself to keep her expression calm, though her hands trembled as she held the page. Rebecca, seated behind her, leaned forward to glance at it and immediately whispered that the signature was a forgery, too consistent to have been written naturally, likely traced or digitally manipulated before being printed. Yet Karen presented it as fact, turning to the assembled residents and declaring in a voice polished for persuasion that Lillian had agreed to these restrictions and was now attempting to violate them, endangering property values and disrespecting the unity of the neighborhood. The murmurs that rippled through the audience carried both skepticism and unease, and Lillian realized with a sick twist in her chest that Karen was not only attacking her legality but eroding her reputation, casting her as a dishonest outsider who could not be trusted. When her turn came to speak, Lillian rose from her chair, unfolding her own documents with deliberate steadiness, and explained in detail the process she had followed. The permit application submitted to the city, the inspections passed by licensed. Engineers, the safety requirements fully met. She held up the stamped approvals, pointing out the dates and signatures of officials whose authority surpassed that of any neighborhood board. And she reminded the audience that the shelter was not a vanity project, but a matter of survival in a state where storms arrived with brutal unpredictability. A few heads nodded, and she caught the eyes of two families who had young children, their expressions softening as they seemed to imagine themselves in her position. For the first time she felt a flicker of support, fragile but real, like the first breeze before a storm. Karen, however, did not yield. With the theatrical timing of someone who relished the spotlight, she pulled out a second document. This one a supposed letter from a previous board member describing concerns about homeowners attempting unauthorized structures in the past. The letter was vague, lacking dates or details, but Karen wielded it as though it were a precedent carved in stone, her voice rising with righteous indignation as she warned that allowing Lillian's shelter would open the door to chaos. Garages, converted into apartments, sheds turned into workshops, fences painted garish colors. The absurdity of the slippery slope argument would have been laughable in another context, but here, in the charged silence of the community hall, it landed like a warning, and several heads turned toward Lillian with doubt clouding their eyes. Rebecca finally stood, asking for permission to address the board, and though Karen attempted to deny her, the bylaws required that homeowners be allowed representation. Rebecca spoke calmly but firmly, pointing out the irregularities in the so-called covenant agreement, noting that the signature lacked natural variance and that the document had not been recorded with the county as required for validity. She also highlighted the absence of any legal standing for the vague letter Karen produced, emphasizing that it was nothing more than hearsay. Her words carried weight, and a tension settled over the room as residents exchanged glances, suddenly aware that what had seemed like certainty was unraveling into suspicion. The confrontation escalated into an uneasy stalemate, with Karen doubling down on accusations while Rebecca methodically dismantled each claim. Finally, in a moment that shifted the mood of the entire meeting, one of the board members, a man named David who had remained silent until now, leaned forward and asked in a measured tone why the alleged covenant agreement had never been disclosed. During Lillian's home purchase, a question that cut through the fog of argument like a blade. Karen hesitated, her polished composure cracking just slightly, and though she quickly recovered, The pause was long enough to plant doubt. Lillian seized the moment, reminding everyone present that she had moved into the neighborhood seeking safety and community, not conflict, and that she had no desire to fight but every right to protect her son. By the time the meeting adjourned, no resolution had been declared, but the atmosphere had shifted. Karen still held sway, but the certainty of her dominance was weakened, and Lillian felt the first stirrings of resistance among the neighbors who had previously avoided her. A few even approached quietly afterward, murmuring words of encouragement or asking tentative questions about the shelter, as though the idea of safety for their families was beginning to outweigh loyalty to the rigid authority of the association. Lillian left the hall exhausted but not defeated, her folder of documents heavier in her hands than when she arrived, because it now carried not only the weight of paper but the fragile possibility of change. Still, the night was bittersweet, for she understood that Karen would not retreat gracefully. The forged document was proof that this was no longer a simple disagreement, but a calculated attempt to trap her in a web of lies, and the brief flickers of support she had felt would only provoke Karen to strike harder, determined to crush dissent. Before it grew, Lillian drove home with Ethan asleep in the back seat, the glow of streetlights flickering across his face, and she whispered a silent vow to herself that she would see the shelter completed, not merely as a structure of concrete and steel, but as a testament to resilience in the face of manipulation and control. The war was far from over, but for the first time she sensed that Karen's power was not invincible, and that realization, fragile though it was, became the spark that kept her standing when everything else tried to push her down. The days following the tense community meeting unfolded with an unnerving quiet that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a storm, and Lillian quickly realized that Karen was regrouping, preparing to strike again with renewed force, rather than accepting the cracks that had appeared in her authority. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps the doubt sown in the meeting might temper the hostility, yet within a week the next wave arrived, this time in the form of an official lawsuit filed in the county court, alleging that she had violated the association's bylaws by engaging in unauthorized construction and demanding not only that the shelter be permanently removed, but that she pay damages and legal fees for disturbing the harmony of the neighborhood. The sheer audacity of the complaint left her momentarily breathless, because it transformed what had been harassment into a formal battle with the weight of the legal system behind it, and she could not ignore the reality that Karen had succeeded in escalating the conflict into a costly and public ordeal. Rebecca assured her that the lawsuit was weak, its arguments resting on the same forged documents and vague claims already challenged in the meeting, but she also warned that fighting in court would require time, money, and endurance. The association's strategy, she explained, was not necessarily to win, but to exhaust her, to drag her through months of hearings and filings until she either gave up or settled under pressure. Lillian nodded, her stomach churning, and wondered how long she could keep pushing forward when her savings were already stretched thin, and Ethan's needs pressed against her conscience with every grocery bill and school expense. Yet, when she thought of abandoning the shelter, she remembered the trembling of his small body in her arms during that tornado, and she knew surrender was impossible, because giving in would mean betraying not only herself, but the fragile sense of safety he deserved. Karen's tactics grew more personal as the case moved forward. Flyers appeared in mailboxes accusing Lillian of recklessly endangering property values, written in the same polished but venomous tone that mirrored Karen's speeches. An anonymous letter arrived in Lillian's mailbox suggesting that good mothers don't bring shame on their children, a line so cruel that she ripped the paper apart with shaking hands before Ethan could see it. At the grocery store, she overheard a neighbor muttering about troublemakers who don't respect the community, and though she suspected the words were planted, they still stung, weaving into the fabric of isolation that Karen was carefully constructing around her. The financial weight began to press heavily. The HOA levied daily fines that Rebecca instructed her not to pay because they lacked legitimacy, yet the numbers accumulated in threatening notices, each one implying that bankruptcy and foreclosure lurked just around the corner. One afternoon, as she returned from work, she found a neon orange notice taped to her garage door announcing that her account with the HOA was delinquent and that further enforcement action would be considered. A public humiliation designed not only to frighten her but to broadcast her supposed guilt to every passing neighbor. Ethan, seeing the bright paper, asked if they were going to lose their home, and though she reassured him with a steady voice, the question lingered in her mind like a shadow she could not dispel. As the court date approached, Rebecca uncovered more disturbing details. Through a careful review of the HOA's financial filings, she discovered irregularities suggesting that fines collected from homeowners had been funneled into accounts connected to Karen's brother, who operated a construction company specializing in approved neighborhood improvements. It was no coincidence, Rebecca argued, that Karen had opposed Lillian's independent shelter because the real scheme involved forcing residents to abandon personal projects and instead purchase inflated services through her brother's business, enriching the family under the guise of protecting community standards. The revelation was both validating and chilling, because it proved Lillian's instincts correct, yet also revealed the depth of corruption she was facing. Rebecca advised gathering testimony from other residents who might have suffered similar treatment, but fear ran deep in the neighborhood. A retired couple quietly admitted that they had been forced to tear down a garden shed after being fined relentlessly, but they refused to provide a statement, whispering that they could not endure another fight with the board. Another family hinted at being coerced into hiring Karen's brother's company for unnecessary repairs, but clammed up when asked for details, clearly terrified of retaliation. Each silence drove home the reality that Karen had cultivated an empire of fear, and Lillian was standing almost alone against it. Despite the mounting stress, Lillian prepared for the courtroom battle with meticulous care, reviewing her documents nightly, memorizing the sequence of permits and inspection reports until she could recite them in her sleep. She tried to shield Ethan from the worst of it, focusing their conversations on schoolwork and ordinary routines, but even in quiet moments she felt the tension vibrating beneath the surface, an unspoken awareness that their lives were being defined by conflict they had never chosen. Some nights she sat awake at the kitchen table, the pile of papers spread before her like pieces of a puzzle she was desperate to solve, and she reminded herself again and again that Karen thrived on intimidation, that every new letter, every whispered rumor was designed to erode her spirit. The true escalation, however, came not from paper or whispers, but from an unexpected visit. One evening, as twilight bled into night and the cicadas sang in the trees, a knock sounded on her door. When she opened it, a man in a suit introduced himself as a mediator hired by the HOA, offering her a chance to resolve the matter quietly, if she agreed to remove the shelter and pay a reduced fine. His words were smooth, practiced, but beneath them Lillian sensed the same menace that threaded through Karen's threats, and when she refused, he gave a thin smile and said in a voice laced with warning, "You might find that fighting people like this costs more than you expect." Then he left without another word, leaving her standing in the doorway with the weight of his insinuation pressing on her chest. It was no longer merely about rules, it was about breaking her will. That night, staring into the dark backyard where the unfinished shelter lay like a wound in the earth, Lillian felt the full gravity of what she was facing. The association had escalated from letters to lawsuits, from whispers to veiled threats, and she understood that the next battle would not simply be about concrete or bylaws, but about truth itself, whether the court would see through the web of forged documents and fabricated narratives, or whether Karen's machinery of control would succeed in crushing her. And, though fear tightened its grip, she also felt the ember of defiance burn hotter, because the deeper Karen pushed, the clearer it became that surrender would never bring peace only submission, and Lillian had no intention of teaching her son that. Safety came at the cost of dignity. The courtroom was colder than Lillian expected, its air conditioning humming with a relentless chill that seeped into her bones as she sat at the long wooden table beside Rebecca, clutching the folder of documents that had become her shield in this drawn-out war. Across from her, Karen occupied her seat with a practiced air of superiority, her blazer crisp, her hair immaculate, her eyes sharp with the confidence of someone convinced that appearances alone could bend truth to her will. A small cluster of board members sat behind her, whispering like loyal courtiers. Their presence meant to reinforce the image of united authority, while Karen's attorney, a tall man with a polished voice and an endless supply of condescension, shuffled papers with exaggerated precision as though he had already secured victory. Lillian tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that this was the moment everything had been building toward, the place where paper, lies, and intimidation would finally meet the scrutiny of law. When the judge entered, the room shifted into tense silence, and the proceedings began with the HOA's attorney presenting their case in a voice smooth as glass, describing Lillian as a homeowner who had willfully violated covenants, disregarded community harmony, and created a hazard by excavating without proper authorization. He produced the forged covenant agreement with dramatic timing, placing it on the judge's desk as though unveiling a sacred text, and declared that it proved beyond doubt her violation. Karen watched from her seat with the faintest of smiles, her hands folded neatly, her entire body radiating certainty, as though the weight of her influence was enough to tip the scales of justice. For a few minutes, Lillian felt the chill deepen, as though the courtroom itself leaned toward believing the narrative that had been so carefully constructed against her. Then Rebecca rose, calm and deliberate, her voice carrying a quiet authority that filled the room without need for theatrics. She began by acknowledging the existence of the document but immediately pointed out its flaws: the unnatural uniformity of the signature, the lack of county filing, the absence of witness or notary seals. She presented expert testimony from a handwriting analyst who had reviewed the page and concluded that the signature was not naturally written, but mechanically replicated, a detail that drew the judge's attention sharply. From there, she moved methodically through the permits, holding up stamped approvals from the city, inspection reports signed by licensed officials, and correspondence confirming the legality of the shelter. Her approach was not to match the HOA's dramatics, but to layer fact upon fact, building a wall of legitimacy so dense that the cracks in the opposing case became impossible to ignore. The turning point came when Rebecca introduced financial records she had subpoenaed, documents showing that fines collected by the HOA had been funneled into accounts linked to Karen's brother's construction company. The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the quiet courtroom, breaking the smooth cadence of the HOA attorney's performance and sending murmurs through the spectators seated in the back. Rebecca explained with precise clarity how homeowners had been coerced into abandoning independent projects and pressured into hiring the brothers' company for inflated services, creating a scheme of profit masked as neighborhood protection. The judge's expression hardened as he scanned the spreadsheets, and Lillian saw for the first time a flicker of unease in Karen's composure, a tightening of the jaw, a brief flick of her eyes toward her attorney as though demanding reassurance. It was in that fragile moment of shifting power that the unexpected occurred. David, the board member who had shown hesitation at the earlier community meeting, stepped forward to testify. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, strength gathered behind his words, confessing that he had been pressured to sign off on fabricated complaints and that the covenant agreement presented against Lillian had been placed in his hands. Already complete, with Karen instructing him to approve it without question. He admitted that he had grown weary of the manipulation and feared the repercussions, but seeing the lengths to which the board had gone had compelled him to speak, even at risk to himself. The courtroom stilled, all eyes shifting to Karen, whose mask of control fractured visibly as she hissed under her breath to her attorney, unable to hide the fury boiling beneath her polished exterior. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers, and after a pause that seemed to stretch across the room, he spoke with measured clarity. The evidence of forgery, the testimony of coercion, and the financial irregularities formed a pattern that could not be ignored, and he declared that the HOA's claims against Lillian were without merit. Furthermore, he ordered that the fines levied against her be nullified, that the shelter construction be allowed to proceed without further interference, and that the association bear full responsibility for her legal fees. His voice did not rise, yet the weight of his words carried the force of finality, and as they echoed in the still room, Lillian felt the tightness in her chest release for the first time in months, a flood of relief nearly overwhelming her. Karen sat frozen, her carefully composed image collapsing into stunned silence, and though she attempted to protest, the judge silenced her with a raised hand, reminding her that attempts to manipulate the court would not be tolerated. The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves, their loyalty cracking now that the foundation of Karen's dominance had been exposed. Lillian glanced at Rebecca, who gave a small nod of satisfaction, and in that moment, she realized that the war she had fought not only for her son's safety but for her dignity had reached its climax, and though the scars of the battle would linger, the truth had finally broken through the layers of lies. The aftermath of the trial unfolded not in a burst of celebration, but in a gradual unwinding of tension, like a tightly coiled spring finally released after being stretched to the breaking point, and for Lillian, the first sensation was not triumph, but a deep, quiet exhaustion that settled over her body as she walked out of the courthouse with Rebecca at her side and Ethan holding her hand. The sun was warm on her face, brighter than it had seemed in weeks, and yet she felt almost too tired to notice, her mind replaying the judge's ruling over and over as though afraid that the words might vanish if she stopped hearing them. For the first time in months, she could breathe without the weight of fines and accusations pressing down on her chest, and in that simple act of breathing she realized how much of her life had been consumed by the battle. The neighborhood reacted in subtle waves rather than sudden shifts. Some residents who had avoided her now offered tentative nods or small smiles when they passed, as though silently acknowledging both the injustice she had endured and the courage it had taken to endure it. A few, emboldened by Karen's downfall, whispered stories of their own encounters with the board, confessions of fines paid without question or projects abandoned under pressure, and though their words carried regret, they also revealed the cracks in the foundation of fear that Karen had built her authority upon. At night, as she sat on the porch watching Ethan play in the yard, she noticed how the silence of the neighborhood felt different, no longer heavy with suspicion, but tentative, searching, as if the community itself was learning how to breathe again. Karen, stripped of her authority and facing scrutiny for the financial irregularities exposed in court, vanished from public view, her once constant presence on the sidewalks and at the board meetings replaced by drawn curtains and an empty driveway. The power she had wielded so effortlessly dissolved in the wake of exposure, and the absence of her control left the neighborhood strangely unmoored, uncertain of what would come next but no longer bound by the iron grip of her rules. For Lillian, the victory was not about Karen's fall but about the shelter that could finally be completed. The hole in the backyard transformed from a symbol of conflict into the very refuge she had promised her son, a place where fear could be met, with certainty rather than helplessness. When the contractors returned weeks later to finish their work, Ethan stood beside the small steel door set into the ground and asked if they could sit inside just once before the storms returned. Lillian followed him down the narrow steps, her hand brushing the cool concrete walls, and as she settled on the bench beside him, she felt the strange comfort of solidity, the knowledge that whatever winds might rage above, here they would endure. Ethan leaned against her shoulder, whispering that he wasn't afraid anymore, and she closed her eyes, letting the quiet surround her, understanding that this was not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of a life, reclaimed from fear, one built, not on submission to control, but on the stubborn, unyielding insistence that safety, dignity, and truth were worth fighting for.